On 29 January, the European Parliament will debate a joint motion for resolution against the Citizenship Amendment Act passed by Indian Parliament in December 2019. A total of 6 resolutions have been tabled by groups within the European Union. India has strongly objected to the move, calling it unwarranted and uncalled for. Vice President M. Venkaiah Naidu has stated that there is no scope for international interference in India's internal policies, while Lok Sabha Speaker Om Birla has conveyed to the European Parliament that it is inappropriate for one legislature to pass judgments on another and that it will set a wrong precedent. On the show today, we talk about the European Parliament. What does it do? What powers does it have? And what is the scope and likely impact of its resolutions? So last week, the European Parliament saw 6 resolutions criticizing the Citizenship Amendment Act that was passed by both houses of Indian Parliament in December. India has reacted strongly to the move, stating that CAA and also the abrogation of Article 370 are internal matters and that no outsider should interfere in it. While Vice President and Rajya Sabha Chairman M. Venkaiah Naidu called the move unwarranted, Lok Sabha Speaker Om Birla has written to the European Parliament's President. More details in this report. A section of lawmakers moved 6 resolutions in the European Parliament against the Citizenship Amendment Act or the CAA last week. They alleged that the CAA marks a dangerous shift in India's citizenship regime. Some of the resolutions refer to Article 370 that gave special status to Jammu and Kashmir. The Indian Parliament passed the Citizenship Amendment Act in December 2019. The resolutions were tabled by groups within the European Union, including the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, group of the European People's Party, group of the Greens European Free Alliance, European Conservatives and Reformist group, among others. The European Union has distanced itself from the resolutions. EU spokesperson for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Virgin Batu Henriksen, said these texts are only drafts tabled by various political groups. The opinions expressed by them were not reflective of the official position of the 28-member Political and Economic Union. India has objected to the anti-CAA resolutions in the European Parliament. Vice President M. Venkaiah asserted there was no scope for interference in India's internal matters. He said foreign bodies interfering in matters that are within the purview of the Indian Parliament and the Indian government is uncalled for and unwarranted.
Recently, some efforts are being made outside India to comment on some laws made by Parliament and to raise some issues based on inadequate knowledge and insufficient understanding of the issues sought to be addressed by our lawmakers. Such efforts are totally uncalled for, unwarranted. Let me make it very clear. As the Vice President and also Chairman of the Upper House of India, Parliament, these comments are totally uncalled for and unwarranted. As a mature republic and democratic polity, we are capable of addressing the concerns if any of our citizens, and we need no advice or guidance in such matters from others.
Lok Sabha Speaker Om Birla also conveyed his displeasure to the European Parliament President David Maria Sassoli. He wrote, and I quote, "As members of Inter-Parliamentary Union, we must respect sovereign processes of fellow legislatures, especially in democracies. It was inappropriate for one legislature to pass judgments on another, a practice that could surely be misused by vested interests. I would urge you to consider the proposed resolution in this light, confident that none of us set an unhealthy precedent," unquote.
But they keep interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. It has become a habit. It's as if the European Parliament has assumed the authority of a global policeman and telling the world what's right with you, what's wrong with you. The entire global relationship is based on the policy of non-interference, and they are blatantly disregarding it. So that is point one. I think they have no locus standi. I think that it comes from superiority complex which is highly misplaced. And last I heard, India is an independent country. We are a country of 1.3 billion people. We are one of the most vibrant democracies in the world. We would suggest to the European Parliament to please mind their own business, and India will take decisions in its wisdom, not as per the cue of the European Parliament.
Union Law Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad also questioned the move by members of the European Parliament, asking if they had ever raised their voices over the victimization of minority Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan.
The government of India has already explained that this is our internal matter. We believe in engagement, and lots of left parties also there have sought this resolution. Our Minister of External Affairs will engage with them and explain the position. Let me ask a counter question. Have my esteemed friends of the European Parliament sought to raise a voice over the victimization of Hindu girls in Pakistan? Sikh Granthi's daughter in Pakistan? It is high time they also need to be objective.
The European Parliament is set to debate the resolutions at its plenary session on 29 January and then put them to vote on the 30th of January. While the resolutions are non-binding, India is stepping up diplomacy ahead of the vote. France, a founding member of the European Union, has backed India against the European Parliament. Diplomatic sources said France has called the new citizenship law an internal political matter of India. The move comes ahead of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Brussels in March for the India-EU summit. Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar is expected to visit in mid-February. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Let's now talk about what the European Parliament does. For the European Union, the European Parliament is an important forum for political debate and decision-making. Its members are directly elected in all member states to represent people's interests with regard to EU lawmaking. Unlike traditional legislatures, the European Parliament cannot propose legislation, but laws cannot pass without its approval. It also approves the EU budget and oversees the European Commission. More details on the role and powers of the European Parliament in our next report.
The European Parliament is the European Union's only institution that is directly elected by its citizens, with representatives in proportion to each member state's population. It is the centre of debate on issues affecting the 28 member states and their citizens, having legislative, supervisory and budgetary responsibilities. The Parliament sits in both Brussels and Strasbourg, with members of European Parliament shuttling between the two. Its administrative offices are in Luxembourg. There are 751 members of European Parliament at present. It will come down to 705 once UK leaves the European Union. The number of members of European Parliament for each member state is proportionate to its population, but no country can have lesser than 6 or more than 96 MEPs. Members of European Parliament represent the second largest electorate in the world, about 512 million EU citizens after the Indian Parliament.
This is an institution which is based in Strasbourg, and though it is connected with the European Union as a whole, but the link with the European Commission is a bit loose. Actually, it is supposed to refer to the various European legislations, whether human rights, whether with regard to the democratic situation, whether the situation of refugees. So there are mostly social issues which they deal with, because the hard issues of foreign policy, strategic relations, etc. are very strongly guarded by the individual countries, members of the EU.
In its legislative role, the European Parliament passes laws that have been proposed by the European Commission. It also asks the Commission to propose legislation. The Parliament has supervisory and budgetary responsibilities as well. It shares powers of budget and legislation with the Council of the European Union, which represents EU member state governments. 23 committees in Parliament deal with policy areas such as security and defence, human rights, international trade and constitutional affairs, which examine proposals for legislation. The members of European Parliament can propose amendments or rejection of a bill. Plenary sessions in which the MEPs gather to vote on proposed legislation are held 4 days each month in Strasbourg. The Parliament also scrutinizes democratic processes of all the EU institutions, as well as the Commission's reports, including the budget. In addition, international agreements, including trade agreements, require Parliament sign-off. The President of Parliament, who is elected by the body, must also sign off on laws for their passage. The European Parliament has a number of other powers as well. It plays a key role in electing the President of the European Commission. It can also force the Commission's resignation.
On most of the issues, like any parliament, it takes a decision by majority, so that is 50% plus one. But it is not a parliament, it is a parliament minus, if I were to say so, because intrinsically it has no powers. Each member state has, like for the UN, what is UN? United Nations. United Nations as such has no powers. But the member states, 193 member states have given up power. We have to appreciate vests with a sovereign state. But the sovereign states concede a part of their powers either concurrently or absolutely to another international body, UN or the European Parliament in this case. So that it is within that ambit that the European Parliament functions, and it has limited powers and it has procedures which are quite complicated.
The President of European Parliament presides over its debates and activities and represents it both within the EU and internationally. At the beginning of every European Council meeting, the President of the European Parliament sets out Parliament's point of view and its concerns as regards the items on the agenda and other subjects. After the European Union's budget has been adopted by Parliament, the President signs it, rendering it operational. The President of the European Parliament and the President of the Council both sign all legislative acts adopted under ordinary legislative procedure. The President serves a term of 2.5 years, which is half the lifetime of the Parliament and usually divided between the two biggest political parties. The European Parliament sits in 8 political groups organized by affiliation rather than nationality. At least a quarter of the member states must be represented within each group, and 25 members are needed to form one group. MEPs can also sit as non-attached members. Before every vote in the plenary, political groups scrutinize reports drawn up by the parliamentary committees and table amendments to them. The position adopted by the political group is arrived at by discussion within the group. No member can be forced to vote in a particular way. The European Parliament's delegations maintain relations and exchange information with parliaments in non-EU countries. Through its delegations, it helps to represent the European Union externally and to promote in third countries the values on which the European Union is founded, namely the principles of liberty, democracy, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms and the rule of law. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And with that, time for a short break here on the program. We'll be right back. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching In Depth. The 2009 Treaty of Lisbon defines relations between the European Parliament and national parliaments of the member countries. What more does the treaty say? Let's find out in our next report.
The European Union is a unified trade and monetary body of 28 European member countries. It eliminates all border controls between members, allowing free flow of goods and people. The number of EU members will come down to 27 when the United Kingdom will cease to be a member on January 31st this year. Contributions of 120 billion euros a year from member states fund the EU. Three bodies run the European Union. The EU Council represents national governments and sets policies and new legislations. The European Parliament debates and approves laws proposed by the Council, and its members are elected every 5 years. The European Commission is the EU staff which execute the laws.
I think this is one of the biggest experiments that was made in history, and that too a successful one to a large extent, when the EC, European Commission, which then became the EU, was established. And it is the largest grouping in the world. It has grown, not that it's not without challenges. And it started as an economic grouping, but then the effort is to make it also a political grouping to strengthen the security cooperation, because the military side or the defense side is NATO, which is EU plus. And on the economic and political side, they also wanted to bring in a legislative body. And the European Commission, European Parliament was constituted in 1958. Currently, it has 751 members, which are drawn from the 28 EU countries, roughly in proportion to the population of a European country.
The national parliaments of the European Union are the legislatures responsible for each member state of the European Union and have a certain degree of institutionalized influence to scrutinize proposed European Union law. The European Parliament cooperates with national parliaments to ensure democratic scrutiny over EU's actions. Relations between the European Parliament and national parliaments are defined in the Treaty of Lisbon, entered into force in December 2009. The key activities of national parliaments in relation to the EU can be summarized as to scrutinize, influence and hold to account their own governments, to engage in dialogue with the EU institutions, notably the European Commission and the European Parliament, to conduct a subsidiarity check on EU legislative proposals and inter-parliamentary cooperation.
Anybody who doesn't get full satisfaction from the national legislations, from the national institutions, generally would go to European Parliament, and they would definitely find some people or the other to support them on these issues. And I have seen very many times that the refugees or the people of foreign origin who feel that the national countries, national members of the European Union are taking very hard line against the foreign populations, against the migrants, then they go to the European Union and take up their cause there, and generally they are able to get some satisfaction in the European Parliament, also in the European Court of Human Rights and other European institutions.
National parliaments and the European Parliament have a vital and complementary role to play in the European Union. In 2018, the European Parliament adopted a resolution concerning national parliaments, where it pointed out that national parliaments are improving and contributing actively to the good constitutional functioning of the European Union, thus providing for more pluralism and democratic legitimacy. It also acknowledged that national governments' accountability to national parliaments remains the keystone of the role of national parliamentary chambers in the European Union. It also put forward a number of suggestions aiming at reinforcing the existing instruments of cooperation between the European Parliament and the national parliaments. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And that's it from us on this edition of In Depth. We'll be back same time tomorrow now with a focus on some other subject of significance. Just in case you missed the television broadcast of our program, let me remind you that you can also watch it online.